Ready, aim, fire. Ready, aim, fire. Aim, fire.
Did you know that the first public civic memorial in the United States to honor Vietnam veterans is located right here in Charlottesville? Join us today as we visit the Hill That Heals and learn about the Dogwood Vietnam Memorial Foundation. Come on.
In Vietnam, we lost a whole generation of young men and women, just like my brother, who would have made wonderful contributions to our country. And I think it's important that we as a community and as a nation recognize our veterans and the sacrifice they've made.
It's like we breathe life back into these young men one more time for a few minutes, and their family and their friends all know what we're trying to do, and we're trying to honor their memory.
The Dogwood Vietnam Memorial was conceived in a barber shop. The Vietnam War was just getting started, and Charlottesville and Albemarle had experienced its first casualty, death of Champ Jackson Lawson Jr. And we knew that other deaths would come along, and we felt like something had to be done to honor them and to honor their families. So we came about an idea of a memorial.
Putting the memorial together, it was requested that everything that it was made with have historical value, be local. Talk about that.
Not everything, but I approached city manager James E. Bowen and told him what our idea was, and he liked that idea. And he also expressed that he wanted the memorial to be placed in a location that was highly visible, and he wanted to use materials significant to the area. He also said that the city would not fund any of the construction, however, they would accept maintenance of it in their normal operation.
Bruce, as the president of the foundation and as a Vietnam veteran, you refer to the memorial as the Hill That Heals. Talk about that.
That's correct, Terry. It has been the hill that heals for me, and primarily because this gentleman to my left, Jim Shisler, asked me to speak at the memorial in 1995. I'd recently moved back to Charlottesville. I had not talked about Vietnam to anyone for almost 30 years, actually.
You went to Lane High School?
I did.
You went to UVA for a few years?
I only went for 1 year in engineering school, and I wasn't doing well, and the draft was knocking on my door, so I joined the Marine Corps.
And then when you returned, you never talked about it.
I blended in. I turned into a weekend hippie, you might say.
You had the VW van.
VW van with the tie-dyed curtains. I had a Harley chopper, and I played the part of the opposite of a Vietnam vet because I didn't want to be associated with the stigma. I wrote in this thing, the speech, said, because of the stigma associated with Vietnam, I, like many others, rarely spoke of my personal experience in Vietnam. I kept those memories sealed inside me, not revealing them to anyone. I hid my tears when I remembered my fallen friends. I stood for a moment and thought how appropriate it was that Jimmy's final resting place was near the birthplace of our nation's Declaration of Independence, right there at Monticello Mountain. So I guess Jim Shisler started my healing process, and the heal is continued as I focus to help Jim with his work here. These families come from a long ways. It's very meaningful.
I am here to honor my father and his memory. They treat me like royalty and my family like royalty when I come here. But I tell you, it's them, the brave men and women that served. And during that time, it was really, really tough for them.
My sweetheart in high school went to Vietnam in 1969, and he was killed February the 14th, 1970. And I had been coming to this memorial for only 3 years. I've been trying to make it as a healing process because I've never really done that. And it's, even after all these years, it's very hard.
Today I have the privilege to talk to you about 4 young men who gave their lives in Vietnam.
One of the events that happens on the Hill every year is the rededication ceremony. Let's talk a little bit about what happens.
When I first started helping Jim, he had been, for 40-some years, he'd been building a stage. Mostly by himself.
Putting a stage
He's still
together
a stout-
for each dedication ceremony,
He's
rebuilding
still a pretty
stage.
stout man, but he did need a little help. He'll admit to that. So I did see him out there with that and started helping him, volunteering and cutting grass around the memorial until 2014.
Yes, when the extension of McIntyre Road and the ultimate interchange redesign was finally came about with the need more pronounced than it had been, and funding finally becoming available, I was asked to join, and I asked Bruce to join with me on that advisory committee. And we worked for about 5 years, but our real purpose, Bruce's and mine, was to preserve and to greaten the Dogwood Vietnam Memorial, mostly to preserve it.
Now, Jim Carpenter, let's talk a little bit about how it has changed over the years. It really has changed, especially with the new road going around. But talk about what the memorial looks like today.
Oh, absolutely beautiful up on that hillside. You know, when we used to go up there for the Dogwood Festival, the young ladies would have heels on and would basically aerating up there on the hillside. It was very steep, hard to get to, but now it's flat, it has concrete, it's just beautiful up there. But when it came to these plaques, we actually can tell about who this person was. I had a first cousin that was killed in Vietnam from Barboursville, Virginia. I really don't know who he really was. And all I know, there's a marker there in Barboursville. Mm-hmm. And now when people come up, they can read a little bit and say,
there's a photograph of the fallen on there.
We could describe what their dash is about between their birth date and their death date.
We do remember Oscar Matera, who was a POW-MIA. His plaque is the only one that's not behind the wall. It is over by the POW-MIA flag.
Well, and that reminds me of something you said earlier, Jim. You had a relationship in some way with at least 9 of the 28
9 of those.
veterans.
One of them was Harvey Mulhauser, who was a year and a piece ahead of me in high school. He and I were both Boy Scouts together.
This changed the lives of so many people in Charlottesville. I knew about 4 or 5 of the guys myself at Lane High School, and of course at UVA there were 8 people from UVA, ROTC. The draft was in effect, and it's interesting that out of the 58,312 that we lost in Vietnam, 3 times that many Vietnam vets have committed suicide since then.
It is very important to have a welcome home parade. These men are in their late 60s and 70s, and they finally feel like they did something honorable for our country. And they are just a very special breed of people that love their country. They fought for their country. They did what they were asked for, and we need to support them, even if it's 50 years later.
I think it's very nice to do this, and recognition that, the Vietnam veterans were probably really due. And it's changed a lot to what it used to be, because, today people come up, and thank you for your service. And, a number of years ago, that never happened, and for whatever reason, I don't know.
It's unbelievable after 50 years. So I really enjoyed myself. Yeah, I didn't think this day would ever come.
We just recently had a parade, and Jim is responsible for getting the Dogwood Festival to actually make the Vietnam veteran the honorary Grand Marshal. And even though a lot of Vietnam veterans didn't come forward and get in the parade, they were well represented.
Yeah. Jim, you had an email from someone from a family member, after the parade.
I posted on Facebook just a thank you to all the folks who participated, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, for passing out over 3,000 flags. And I got this note back from a lady who says, I was so proud of all the vets who were in the parade today, my husband being one of them riding on the float. I always felt when a Marine in full dress blues walked up to him and shook his hand and said, welcome home.
Talk about why it's so important to continue with this healing process.
They didn't know what PTSD was when we came back. It was not addressed at all. We were just, one day we're on a battlefield, 24 hours later, we were back in the world, we called it. We're the round-eyed girls, and Quite frankly, we just didn't know what to do. We didn't feel comfortable. I didn't really want to be there. I didn't want any welcome home. I didn't want my parents or anybody to throw a party for me. I left, and I'm still feel like I'm healing. PTSD hit me hard, and it's been a process, and I thank this gentleman for that. My wife may disagree, but I think I'm getting there.
But you have part of the foundation is the camaraderie, bringing families together, bringing the community together to try to understand this war and that experience better.
Sometimes it's hard to do business for the foundation meetings because we get to these relating experiences, not battle stories particularly, but experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important. And I think it also is important to note that a great number and a vast majority of these Vietnam veterans have come home and been very, very successful in business, in professions, and whatever. So it's a whole lot of good is coming out of the Vietnam veterans.
Our Vietnam Memorial is dedicated to all who served their country in Vietnam, and in particular those that gave their lives in that service. We're just hoping that families will take a few minutes with their children and say, there was a war once, and these folks sacrificed for that. They did what they thought was the right thing for our country and served.
Someone asked me a few years into it, how long will this memorial rededication last? And I said, well, until the war is over, or maybe a few years after that, 3 or 4 years after that. I was totally wrong. It's going on from when I was a young man to this period of my life, and it's still going on. And I'm lucky to be a part of it.
God and the soldier all men adore, in times of trouble and then no more. For when the war is over and all things are righted, God is forgotten and the old soldier is slighted. Let that never happen to these young men and to all the other young men and women who are serving our country. Semper Fidelis. Hoorah.